4th of July. Hope you're having a great time with your friends and family, and a very special happy anniversary to my husband. We got married July 4th weekend 2011, and I think back to then, I had no idea I'd be living down the road from where we got married right outside of Austin, Texas. It's funny, the twists and turns of life, isn't it? Just the other day, I was in a local shop. I love this cute little store, and I was killing some time because I got kicked out of the coffee shop across the street because of summer hours. It closes earlier than I thought. So by default, I went into the store simply, for research purposes, and I walked out with a few new items, including two very cool wooden signs. And these signs have a driftwood color frame and this beige sort of weathered background. And one square reads in very clear typewriter font, Land of the Free. And the other square reads, Home of the Brave. And when I saw them, I had to have them. I just love seeing those two sentences in isolation. Land of the Free, Home of the Brave. And I read those sentences and think, yeah, that's right. That's a fact. That's a fact if there ever was one. But it's interesting to think about how neither expression really existed for some of the most important people who made that fact a reality. The Star-Spangled Banner, that has those lyrics, didn't exist until the War of 1812, years and years after the end of the Revolutionary War. And of course, we celebrate America's independence on July 4th and what we did during the Revolution. And it made me think back on something I heard the famous historian David McCullough talk about. And that's the importance of perspective, of remembering the perspective of the individuals at the time, and remembering what they experienced, not from what we now know to be true. And I'll explain that all in a moment. A few weeks ago, I made a special trip to a historic site, a place where timing and weather and luck and perseverance all converged on a snowy, windswept, frigid night more than 200 years ago. It was that night, Christmas 1776, when the idea of celebrating America's independence in the heat of summer would seem absolutely, totally insane. Ridiculous, in fact. That night, General George Washington led a group of men across the Delaware River and really right into history. And you might remember reading something about Washington's crossing of the Delaware, but I know I needed a refresher for sure. We remember the revolution from a point of pride. That's because we know what happened. We know that we won. We know we are free. But those men fighting so many years ago, and quite frankly, some really brave women as well, they didn't have the benefit of knowing the future. And that's what David McCullough pointed out. They knew that they faced death or starvation or imprisonment. They didn't think of fireworks and vacations and celebrations. They didn't know how great they would be. They just kept on going into the unknown with this idea, and it worked. America. They were so brave. The American Revolutionary War lasted 7 years. 7 years. Every time I read that fact, I think, really? Yeah, 7 years. And we tend to think of it as a much shorter war, but a lot of fighting happened and a lot of people lost their lives. And by a simple twist of fate or luck or divine intervention, our interviewee refers to it as a miracle, and he knows it best. Something to think about. By any of that, America didn't lose. We had very near misses, though, of almost losing it all, and we should remember that. And that's why Washington's crossing marks a pivotal moment in all of our stories, because it changed the momentum of the war, and it changed all of our fates. So listen to the story of Washington Crossing, told by Clay Craighead. He's this marvelous historian at Washington Crossing State Park. I had to go there in person. I had to stand on the ground. In a day when electronic records can just simply vanish, it's important to stand where history happened. And we talked a little bit about that. We recorded this interview, by the way, in Clay's office, where he's worked for 30 years. So you'll hear a little bit of the working office sounds in the background. I apologize for that. But, it's sitting in someone's office where they're comfortable that you get the most passion. And I think you're going to hear that in Clay's voice. By the way, there's a moment in our conversation where he mentions bloody footprints in the snow. And truly, that's an image I don't think I'll ever forget. especially this July 4th, in the land of the free and the home of the brave. Take a listen.
I wouldn't have said this early on in my career, but it's the game-saving moment, I think.
Really?
Yeah, it's the situation is so dire prior to Christmas. The British High Command feels that it's practically over. It's just a matter of time. Washington himself, prior to Christmas, confides to a relative in writing that I fear the game's pretty near the up. I mean, it's looking bad. And just to touch on your thing, today with emails, it's a little concerning to me that the documentation for history, letters, the handwritten letters that we have from the Revolution, from the Civil War, that are the first-hand accounts of the people experience. We only have people aren't writing letters as much anymore. It's emails, and is that getting lost? And,
right. Well, one of the points that came. Well, I know it's so true. One of the points that came up in the article was that we everyone sort of erases emails at will, but when you work for the government, that's actually not within your power. It belongs to the people.
Okay.
And so that was sort of the interesting twist in this piece, which was
it's probably just a massive amount.
Yeah, well, it's a massive amount, and people think they can just erase things, and you shouldn't, because you never know when history's going to happen. And when General Washington at the time was writing that about the American Revolution, thinking maybe the end is very near, he had no way of knowing what would become of this nation.
Sure.
And so that's pretty remarkable. So why was it so dire? Why was the situation so bad?
Well, the situation, and again, when I talk, we had the staff ride this morning from Fort Dix, and I had a brief talk, I always, talk about the prelude, and I tend to talk about it excessively, probably more than I should, but I want to set the scene for how bad the situation was. And the prelude to our story, basically, and I like to start with the Declaration of Independence. When the Declaration was declared and everybody was sky high for liberty, the British landed their armies shortly after the Declaration on Staten Island. There was the Battle of Long Island in August. Their objective was to capture New York City, an excellent port facility, as a base of operations. And there's a half a dozen battles: Long Island, Harlem Heights.
And they killed a lot of people.
Well, the casualties from these battles for Washington are severe. There's a number of captured. Fort Washington, nearly 3,000 Americans are captured. And there's a battles of White Plains, Fort Washington, Fort Lee. So there's about a half a dozen engagements, battles that Washington loses. And the British capture New York City. And then Washington falls back into New Jersey from New York in retreat, trying to keep his army between the pursuing British and the capital, Philadelphia. And morale at this time, because of all these defeats and casualties from desertion, short-term enlistments, this is a volunteer army, and they had 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, up to a year at the most enlistments. Enlistments are expiring, guys aren't re-enlisting. There's casualties from the battle, as I said, and just attrition in general, sickness, a lot of guys in the hospitals. So the army, when he falls back into New Jersey, is a fragment of what it had been shortly after the Declaration of Independence, when they were trying to defend New York. And so this series of events, when he falls back to New Jersey, has devastated the army. The support for the army is dwindling away. Washington, in a letter, really goes after New Jersey and Pennsylvania for the lack of support he's getting. And he at one point writes, the conduct of the Jerseys has been most infamous. Instead of coming out to support the army, they're making their submissions as fast as they can. And as I like to sum it up too simply, who wants to join an army that's losing all the battles?
Right.
And that really is the case here prior to Christmas. So Washington retreats to New Jersey. The thing he does, which is the brilliant move and the key to what's going to happen here, the success, is he sends portions of his troops in advance to start gathering the boats along the Delaware River. There's no bridges across the Delaware in 1776. And he's going to try and protect Philadelphia, the capital. And he's going to escape using those boats by crossing the river in early December at Trenton in retreat.
So where is he bringing all the boat? Are they lining them all up, or just keeping them along the shore?
For 70 miles north of Philadelphia, they're gathering anything that floats. So this is a huge logistical operation. The men are to gather, and whether the civilians want to give them up or not, they have no choice. These boats are being taken by the Army so that the British will not have any boats to pursue Washington into Pennsylvania with.
Because again, he's retreating into
That's
Pennsylvania,
right.
though.
That's right. He's escaping across the river. He does this on the night of December 7th into December 8th. He will then hide the boats on the Pennsylvania side. The British reach the river in pursuit at Trenton, just minutes after the last boats are landing. So Washington was reluctantly leaving the state of New Jersey to the enemy, but he had to. And he had hoped when he retreated through New Jersey that the New Jersey militia, the Pennsylvania militia, would come forward to strengthen his army. But because of all the defeats, there was not much enthusiasm to join what was being seen as a losing effort.
So he has boats, but he doesn't have men.
Well, he has a small number that's still with him, but it's not the number that he's hoping to defend New Jersey with. He's not strong enough. But he's going to try and defend the Delaware River, and he's fearful that the British are going to build boats, find boats that he couldn't gather. How confident can you be that you've gotten all the boats? So there was some anxiety, certainly. He writes to Congress in Philadelphia saying if the British, find boats or build boats, my army's not going to stop them. So what does Congress do? And I love pointing this out because this is how bad it is. They adjourn to Baltimore. So they flee the capital.
So they make sure that they're going to be okay.
Well, that's right. Well, and then the population is not far behind in Philadelphia. They're packing up their valuables and they're hightailing it.
And we have to really think. It's just coming to me now, and based on how you're telling the story. If I was a mom with a family in Philadelphia at that time, and I've heard about what the British have done in New York, and I've heard of the Battle of Long Island, infamous. I'm afraid.
Sure.
I'm afraid for my life.
Fearful.
I'm afraid for my children. What's going to happen? Yeah. The British have a notorious reputation. I'm probably going. I'm not just standing behind.
And that's you're neutral. And there certainly was a percentage of people who were, and Quakers especially, they're against the war and they're neutral. They may have stayed, and some loyalists certainly would stay. There's a comical. I find a comical account, and I'm trying to remember who this soldier was, but he basically was coming to Philadelphia, and he was one of the few reinforcements that were coming to join Washington Army, and it's a small number that's coming forward. But he writes that he met with his Quaker in-laws in Philadelphia, and he said they were all glad to see me, and they were happy, and said that the British would be in town in a day or two. So they were elated that the British were going to come in, and in my interpretation, and end the revolution, because Quakers are against war. They
right.
And in some cases, maybe most cases, the rebels are being blamed for instigating this thing, and they want it to end. But I found it, that's what he encountered, and he was serving and fighting the war, and there were some Quakers who certainly fought as well. But again, the situation is bleak. Your government's fleeing, the population's not supporting the army, but Washington has the boats. The British, who look for boats and can't find any, and with mid-December, winter approaching very quickly, you don't campaign actively in the 18th century in winter, so you go into winter quarters, which you wait until spring, and sometimes late spring, early summer before you actively campaign. So they spread their army out throughout New Jersey in a chain of outposts and go back to New York for the winter. They leave Hessian mercenaries, about 1,400 of them, in Trenton.
And they're
right
probably feeling pretty confident at this point.
Very confident, overconfident, I would say. The British High Command, General Howe, writes back to England, explaining the situation to Parliament. And he says, my posts are a little more scattered than I would like, but they should be in relative security.
It'll be fine.
They're just facing Washington and the rebel army, nothing to be majorly concerned about. And that's, they have some reason for that, because Washington hasn't done well in the New York campaign. But they're open to a rude surprise. They're going to get surprised here. And Washington, of course, is desperate to get something positive going. If he goes into winter quarters without a victory, it's going to be a hard sell to get men to volunteer to join this losing army and what's being seen by many as a losing effort. So he knows he needs to get something positive going, and so he takes the risk, the gamble, to cross the Delaware River here on Christmas night in a snowstorm. That wasn't planned by Washington, but a nor'easter developed during the night. As I like to joke, to add a little extra drama to a pretty dramatic situation. It takes 10 hours to get the army across, 2,400 men, 18 cannon, maybe 100 or so horses. And it's a 9-mile march once they're across, and it's not till 4 the next morning on December 26th when they're ready to march the 9 miles. It takes about 4 hours. By 8 in the morning, the day after Christmas on the 26th, the battle begins.
What a way to spend your holiday,
Yeah, right.
by the way. It's not like they're walking around in these, weatherproof, snowproof boots, with the great gear that we have right now. I mean, they're in what? They're in their wool uniforms?
Linen uniforms. Their shoes are wearing out in some cases. There's an account that you could follow the bloody footprints in the snow from the soldiers that didn't have proper shoes, or their shoes were coming apart and they were tying them together as best they can. The money for the revolution, the supply isn't there in the early stages. We're a new nation. We just don't have the money and the supply to keep these guys well supplied. So the condition of the army is not good. But again, Washington's desperate to gain a victory to encourage recruitment, encourage enlistment, and encourage some of these guys who, by the way, a lot of these soldiers' enlistments are going to expire at the end of December.
So he's got him for a few more days.
That's right.
He's like, we're going to work to the end.
Amazing being in that predicament. Washington's trying to win battles, but then his army is going to disappear on him in a matter of days, or at least half his army.
Well, and I'll stop you there. We had a short conversation previously about this, but I'm so curious. I know our listeners are going to recall in their mind the amazing painting of George Washington at the bow of a boat, and he's standing there looking so brave. And we know what happened. Right. We know that Washington is a winner. Right. But we also know in history at that moment he didn't know if he was ever going to be a winner, and
it was really in doubt.
Yeah, he probably didn't look like that either. So what are some of the things we should consider when we have that image? Because even when you're describing what you're saying, which is like this is a group that needs a lot of help, when it comes to morale, but also supplies and support. I still come up with that image in my head because it's so salient, and it's also not necessarily true.
Well, it's the iconic image of the crossing. I mean, there's a number of paintings, and I certainly have some that I like a little more than others. But this is the iconic image. Historians are a little tough on it because it's not historically accurate. The flag they're flying hadn't been designed yet. And I joke with our visitors that in a snowstorm during a night crossing when it's very dark, you're probably not flying a flag, but for artistic reasons.
It looks great in the painting.
Right. Yeah, that's right. So that's why it's there. And he's in a small boat and standing up in it. Most likely, and he could have crossed in any type of river craft because they had a motley assortment. They gathered out all the boats they had. But the two principal boats were the ferry boats, which were flat rafts to bring horses, cannon, wagons across, and that's how they would have crossed with those. And then the Durham boats, which were much deeper-sided boats, and they would have been standing in the hold, and you could carry 40 or 50 men. And you would have, painting-wise, you would have seen them from probably mid-waist up, because they would have been standing. So he could have crossed in those boats too. But I like to joke and say we all want to know how Washington crossed today, but the documentation's thin and we don't really know. And nobody really thought it important enough to document.
And no one talked about it? No one said, oh, this is at night, I saw Washington.
Well, some of the accounts, and Washington certainly left the account. Colonel Henry Knox, who was in charge of the crossing on Christmas night, he wrote a letter to his wife, which is very descriptive. But, the details, the nuts and bolts aren't really there. They talk about the weather, how severe the ordeal it was, the ice floating in the river. Knox at one point wrote what seemed impossible was extremely difficult, and that's poorly phrased. I don't have that quote memorized, but I should. But it's a very descriptive account, and some of the soldiers, and again, a lot of the guys who crossed, not many of them can write, so the enlisted man point of view is scanty as well. It's the officers who really have their accounts have survived, who are better educated and could write in most cases. But one of the soldiers who wrote about it described the weather. He focused on the weather and not how they actually crossed. He said basically we were ferried across the river, and the storm, what does he say? It hailed, rained, snowed, and blew like a hurricane. So he focuses on the weather, which to him was the main part of the night. It was a miserable night for the guys.
One of the things I've always been curious about, because my image of the Delaware is not one that has huge waves like an ocean, and often it's portrayed, it almost looks like an ocean Is that the way that you think it was?
No, and again, that's the Leutze painting, the Manuel Leutze painting, which shows Washington standing in the boat. A German artist painted that, and I think he used the Rhine or the Seine,
one of those other rivers,
in Europe, which is a much wider river. So the view from the painting is it's a much bigger river. Here, I mean, the river's about 850 feet across. It would have been running high and swift with ice. And I've seen when I cross the river every day, across the narrow bridge here at Washington Crossing. And on windy days, you see some small whitecaps. You see it gets choppy. Whether that way is
do you think
Christmas
of Washington when you do? I mean, I know you've been here 30 years. Like, still, when you cross during those wintry days, do you think of?
Occasionally, it's neat, and it doesn't happen too often when there's ice in the river. That's what really when I'm crossing on a summer day. I don't necessarily think it much, and I cross it more often than not because I sometimes go across the river for lunch. There's an excellent pizza place there, but anyway.
Also wasn't here during Washington's times.
But when the river gets nearly filled with ice, and there's been in my 30 years 2 or 3 years winters when the river almost froze over, which is more ice than what Washington had to deal with. According to one of the accounts from the soldiers, there was floating ice in the river, and I joke with this, and he says it wasn't very thick. Now, what his interpretation of what isn't very thick is anybody's guess.
Right.
But it wasn't, big ice chunks going down the river, at least not here. Now, the other units that crossed Christmas night were supposed to cross. And this was the overall strategy. Washington was crossing here. He had 2 other units downriver that were supposed to cross, one just below Trenton and one at Bristol. They ran into more ice because the Delaware River is tidal all the way up to Trenton. The Trenton Falls, which is a rapids, stops the tide. Washington crossing above the tide, here at Washington Crossing, the ice was more evenly distributed. Just below Trenton, the tides had created an ice jam, and the unit that was supposed to cross under General Ewing didn't even attempt it. It was wall-to-wall ice.
So you're mentioning something that in preparation for our conversation, I stumbled upon it. I hadn't learned this before. If I did learn it, I forgot. Apologies to my middle school history teachers who worked so hard to make sure that we remembered things. I didn't recall that Washington wasn't supposed to be alone, that others were supposed to cross with him to support this attack.
Yeah.
And so getting back to, speaking of the story where we sort of left off, so Washington crosses in the middle of the night. They march 9 miles in terrible conditions.
Yeah.
Thinking that they are going to what? To have support from other people?
Well, he did get, during the night, the crossing took so long, 10 hours, he did get some messages that they were having difficulty downriver. So that did reach him. Fortunately, those other units weren't needed, as it turned out. Washington's force is the striking force, the attacking force. The others are supporting. Had Ewing crossed just below Trenton, he was supposed to cut off the escape route south out of town. Had he been there and not been discovered as he crossed, which I question whether that would have been too wise crossing so near Trenton, and it could have, if he was discovered, it could have ruined his prize. But had he crossed, they maybe captured a couple hundred more Hessians, so because there were a few hundred that did escape. And had Cadwalader crossed, he was supposed to keep another enemy post south of Trenton busy and occupied, so they wouldn't reinforce Trenton. The battle's over in practically an hour.
Really?
So, yeah,
so
it's a quick
wait
battle.
a minute. How did that?
So they were out of range anyway. They weren't going to get here to support.
But the Hessians that again have a reputation for being fierce fighters. Yeah. Was it just simply they were so caught off guard, or what happened?
And let me.
Or am I skipping over? Please,
No,
take us back.
There's a lot to talk about, of course, and trying to do it, quickly. The Hessians. We're there for about a week and a half prior to Christmas. They're being harassed. They're being constantly skirmishes. There's small boatloads of Americans coming across, beating up the Hessian guard posts. Some New Jersey militia has remained in the state, and they're making life miserable for the Hessians.
So the New Jerseyans haven't all abandoned.
No, that's right.
Washington,
and they're still being active, and they're getting more active because now they're being occupied.
Sounds a little bit like the Jersey Shore sort of situation. I got these images of like the tough guy New Jersey guys that are coming over.
Well,
and,
there's there's some well publicized atrocities as well. I mean,
Really?
by the occupying force. I mean, and the
So there's
Patriots.
reasons why
Oh
they're
yeah,
getting
yeah,
harassed.
yeah, and they're being it's a propaganda war as well, and so some of these atrocities are being well publicized by the Patriots.
What are some
to
of the
show.
atrocities?
Well, there's some people being killed, women being assaulted. This is an occupying military power, and there's some things like that taking place.
Abuse, yeah.
And then property being damaged, certainly. And I like to say, whichever army is going to be in your backyard, you're not going to be too happy about it. It's going to be some detriment. But certainly there is some plundering, pillaging, and atrocities taking place. And again, it's a propaganda war to try and sway the population to some extent by both sides. But anyway, the Hessians are being harassed. They're not in a party mood. Let me just touch on this. One of the biggest myths in American history is that the Hessians were drinking, partying,
Sure.
hungover. There's no evidence to support that.
That they were kind of like these guys that kind of like hung out, got paid well, and like were tough guys and drank a lot. That's totally the reputation.
Well, and it's not very accurate. There's no documentation, no evidence to say that they were partying, hungover from celebrating Christmas. And again, for a week and a half, they're being harassed by small raiding parties. One Hessian who kept a diary would write, "We have not slept one night in peace since coming to this place." So their sleep is being disrupted by these potential small-scale attacks, and they're handling it, but they're being degraded. They're being worn down, and they're not prepared for the massive assault that Washington's going to launch. Very vigorous attack. He will have numbers on his side when he attacks, and he surrounds the town very quickly. The Hessians do have guard posts on the outskirts of town to give warning. And Washington takes two roads to Trenton. He divides his column in half so he can hit either end of the town. And these guard posts are encountered and driven in very vigorously. So the Hessians see the Americans coming at these guard posts. Again, they're on the outskirts of town. They fire a volley or two, their muskets at them, and then they have to retreat. They're being overwhelmed. So the main garrison in Trenton of the three Hessian regiments has minutes warning of this attack. And also, one of the three regiments of the Hessians have orders to sleep in uniform to be ready at a moment's notice. So again, the myth that they're hungover, not prepared, and caught off guard isn't the case. They are there, and they're trying to be prepared as best they can. They are going to get overwhelmed. It's a very vigorous attack. The weather is a major factor. It snowed during the crossing, it snowed during the march, it snows during the battle. And when the flintlock muskets that they use in the 18th century get wet due to rain or snow, you can't get sparks to ignite wet gunpowder. It affects both sides, but Washington has a numbers advantage. He brings artillery, 18 cannon across, not affected by the weather. They use bags of gunpowder. The Hessians have 6 small field pieces, and the advantage in artillery and force of numbers is decisive. The Hessians put up a fight. They're chased out of town. They come back at 2 times, 2 counterattacks. Colonel Rahl, the Hessian commander, is mortally wounded. And before they know it, they realize what they're up against. They're outnumbered. They're surrounded. Their leadership is degraded. Their muskets are wet, and there's no escape. So what options left? So after about a 1-hour battle, approximately from first shot to last, they surrender. And that was really the only reasonable option. They're not going to fight to the last man, and either is the British Army, for that matter, or the American Army. When the odds were stacked against, they're going to surrender.
I was curious your thoughts on something while you were telling the story of that is a myth about the Hessians, celebrating Christmas and drinking and all of that. Do you think that was perpetuated to take a little something away from
it
Washington?
Very may have been.
He wasn't as good as we thought he was because they were drunk and they won.
And it starts early on. There's some speculation, and my colleagues and I talk, and the British could have started it. I don't know.
Oh, as a way of that's why they lost.
Well, they were certainly very disappointed in their and really blamed Colonel Rahl is made almost a scapegoat in a sense, and of course he dies and can't defend himself. And there's only one other Hessian officer that comes to his support. And he basically writes that the men, he wrote a diary, it was Johann Ewald, and he writes the men who were criticizing Rahl couldn't have held his sword. So it was a very strong kind of defense, but he was the only one that I've encountered. Everybody else was pointing fingers at Raw that it was the whole problem was his fault. So I think it's a little unfair of Raw. He could have maybe done a few things differently, but had a British officer or British troops been in Trenton, I think the result would have been exactly the same. The overconfidence for the British and the Hessians facing the rebel army, even if outnumbered, they figured they're going up against these militia, untrained soldiers that they could handle. With the bayonet, they could force them out, even if outnumbered. And the only way I think Raw could have saved the situation is as if he had abandoned his post early on, and
retreated.
Yeah, that's right. And I don't think that would have even entered his mind to retreat in the face of the American troops. So that doesn't happen, and again, his brigades basically annihilated, though a few hundred escape early in the battle.
So I know we've exhausted a lot of time.
Yeah, I know.
Okay? But I have two more questions.
I can sum it up quickly, too.
Well, listen, as long as you have, I think the big question is, why does this matter? Why was this so important to the future of America?
Well, again, I'm biased, of course, working here, and everybody who works at all their sites certainly should be and are as well. And every engagement, every battle is so sequential, builds on previous victories. But this is a turning point. It's a morale turning point. To keep the war going. I mean, and the war isn't won by any means. There's 6 more years of battles to be fought before we can win this thing.
But we remember this one.
Yeah,
that's the thing.
The drama is just loaded. I mean, it's a desperate moment. Your back is to the wall. The British feel they have this thing won, and the change. And I like to use it's really almost a miracle event, and viewed by the population at the time. It looked as if the war was over. People were backing off, giving up. We had some diehard patriots that weren't, and Washington certainly is the leader of them, and 2,400 men that crossed here certainly haven't given up. They haven't deserted. Fortunately, they're healthy enough. They're not in the hospital, which many are, and they're persevering. They're not giving up. And this victory is a huge morale, confidence-building victory that's going to allow the war to continue. And the British, quickly realize it. Their opportunity has been to end this thing quickly.
So
is
just
lost.
like that,
That's right.
It's just like the tempo and the rhythm and everything just boom
it's going
changes.
to be a much longer, harder war. And there was a British Lord Germain. I think it's 2 years after the Battle of Trenton, would write, harking back to the time of the crossing. All our hopes were blasted by that unhappy affair at Trenton, is how he phrased it.
I didn't know that. That's amazing.
So 2 years later, he realized the opportunity. And I believe if the British were going to win this thing, it had to be early on, and it had to be before the Americans got any momentum, before the Patriots could win a few battles. And once that happened, it was going to be a really tough, longer war. As long as the will to resist and persevere was there, and certainly Washington had it, and by winning the battles, he had enough, they encouraged enough men to keep joining the army and fighting.
So you've spent 30 years at this park that commemorates in many ways this great event.
Yeah.
What is the one tip, the smarter tip that you can give to anyone that comes and visits the park about what to do that no one knows about, but that you'll tell us clearly?
I don't know if anybody knows if nobody knows about it. We have a lot to offer. Seeing the site as a child when going on vacations with my parents. Why I got interested in history, we visited the sites, and then I started reading. And really, when you read the accounts, the letters of the participants, it gives you goosebumps. They experienced it, and I always questioned.
By the way, that's a phone. They didn't have phones during the American Revolution, but yes. But you were saying. You were saying that.
It's the firsthand accounts. And that's what got me interested. And I always ask myself, what was it like?
Right.
What was it like to be back then and experience what they experienced? And you're right. How do you know? Well, the closest you can get to it is reading what they wrote about it.
The archives. We're back to the archives,
absolutely.
right?
They're letters, they're diaries, and there's some very descriptive accounts, and it does gives you goosebumps. You're almost back there yourself when you read some of these descriptive accounts. But to see the site is certainly there. We have an excellent museum collection here at the Visitor Center, over 500 artifacts. We have an amazing video. I'm very biased with this. New Jersey Public TV produced it for us, the 10 Crucial Days, the Road to Liberty, 27 minutes long, that summarizes our campaign, the crossing, battles of Trenton, and Princeton as well, which we didn't get to talk about. But this 10-day campaign, there's 3 battles, 3 victories for Washington in what's referred to as the 10 Crucial Days.
Okay, final question for you, Clay. As I mentioned before, this is sort of part of a broader series I'm calling Finding America, revisiting our past so that we can really reconnect with what's going on in present time, because I think we need to have the historical context to not only understand current events, but just have the perspective of what's happening in America today when we're sort of struggling with American identity. I mean, just kind of hearing that, what do you think is, if you could say, this is the takeaway from this location or this moment in history, this is the lesson that you think about and what it means for the country, what is that?
Well, I think, again, perseverance is certainly a part of that, sacrifice as well, because certainly, we had a staff ride from Fort Dix here today, and I welcome.
And we should mention, that's when you actually educate young men and women that are in the military.
And these guys pretty much they study it, so but I certainly, I'm sure, gave them some details they weren't aware of, about our story. But it's a staff ride where they study the tactics and strategy to gain, knowledge, so they can utilize it in today's wars, for our military today. But I praise them. I said we had 2,400 diehard patriots across here. I want to thank you folks for our service, and they're certainly sacrificing as well as what our soldiers did prior, and they were sacrificing without knowing that what the outcome would be.
They were sacrificing for the hope and the ideal
that's
of
right.
what could happen.
We
promise.
certainly owe a great debt to what they did, and that's really for all our military personnel throughout all the wars, really. And we've had quite a few, sadly over the years. But yes, perseverance and sacrifice, and we enjoy the freedoms today for what they fought for. Had we lost, it'd be a different story.
Totally different.
Yeah.
You'd have a different office.
Yeah, that's right. Wouldn't have this nice job.
Thank you, Clay.
You're
I
welcome.
appreciate it very
My
much.
pleasure.